Hello, and welcome to Channel Zero TV with John and John. I'm John,
And I'm John.
and tonight we're going to bring you our first silent picture, the 1915 version of The Golem. Actually, this is just fragments of the 1915 film The Golem. John, do you want to explain to people what they're about to watch?
Yes, this is all that remains of the 1915 version of The Golem that starred, was co-directed and co-written by Paul Wagner. About 4 minutes of footage is left out of this. I think it was about an hour long in its original version. But what is left is very, very visually interesting, as you will soon see. Unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of silent films, upwards to, I think, 85% of all silent films are now considered lost because they were shot on something called nitrate stock, which was highly unstable and not really designed to last a very, very long time.
Okay, well, let us take a look at some of this lost footage, and then John and I will be back to talk about the pedigree of the Golem legend and this particular film. Okay, so since the golem myth originates from my particular tribe, I'll try to explain where the idea of the golem creature came from. It is a story that in Jewish mythology or Jewish folklore that goes back, I think potentially as far back as the 12th century, but in the 1600s, the legend was of a rabbi, a mystic, who brought to life a creature made from the earth, made from clay. It sort of harkens to God's creation of Adam, who God breathed life into the lifeless soil or clay, and out of that came man. And so the concept is the golem is something that Jewish mystics could create, also using words as sort of magical incantations. There was a word emet that would appear on the forehead of the golem that would bring him to life. Removing it would sort of immobilize him. I believe actually the word abracadabra originates in Jewish mystical kind of word magic. So, but this was not a production of anybody involved with the Jewish faith. This is a German picture, one of several. John, do you want to kind of explain a little bit about this film and how it fit into Wagner's other work with the same characters?
Yeah, he had a whole career for about 5 years there in Germany during World War One, playing this mythological monster. He played the Golem in three different films. Two of them have not survived, but the third one, the expressionistic masterpiece in 1920, The Golem and How He Came into the World, that fortunately survives. And of course, as everyone knows, that's a masterful display of German expressionism. The two prior films, the fragments of which we saw tonight, the 1915 film is mostly set in then present-day Germany. The Golem has been revived by an antiques dealer in Berlin of 1915, and falls in love with the antiques dealer's daughter, and they have to deal with him lumbering around Kaiser Wilhelm's Berlin. The sequel to that, The Golem and the Dancing Girl, I think it's called, is largely a parody of the first film, in which Paul Wagner, the star of the original film who plays the Golem, puts on his Golem costume to surprise some people at a party, and then gets involved with a chorus girl. And as I said, it's largely a parody of the first film. And in a weird way, in my opinion, these films kind of follow a sort of disjointed pattern that you saw with like Universal Studios in the 30s and 40s with Frankenstein. They start out with a film set in the modern day, veer off into parody, as the Universal Frankenstein movies did, especially with Abbott and Costello, and then end up with this sort of masterful, fully realized Gothic German expressionistic masterpiece. It's almost as if they somehow ran that whole Universal Studios pattern in reverse.
And the 1920s film you're talking about, the Golem and how he came into the world, that is often sort of referred to just as the Golem in popular literature. I remember, when I used to read Famous Monsters of Filmland, I would see images of the Golem, and it was from that 1920s piece, which was really sort of akin to sort of Fritz Lang's Metropolis in terms of its artistry.
Oh yes, it's a tremendous eyeful. It's a tremendous film. It's just so perfectly fully realized.
And so you've got these sort of stories of the origins of the Golem, which is the 1920s film was set, I believe, in sort of 1600s Jewish village where the Golem is brought to life to protect the village from attack by anti-Semites. But then you've got this notion of the Golem being revived in contemporary times. That was a story of this 1915 film, and as you said, that sort of was harkening backwards in time. But the Golem character has showed up in contemporary films. I guess really, to a certain extent, Frankenstein, was that inspired by the Golem?
I think James Whale was probably a who was himself a great student of German expressionism, must have seen it, because so many of sort of the visual motifs from that 1920 film bleed into the original Frankenstein, and then most especially, I would say, The Bride of Frankenstein.
The Golem character also, he's been tried a few times with contemporary horror or fantasy. Never quite took hold. I do remember I think it was a 1970s picture called It with Roddy McDowall, who I guess it's
Yeah.
in a way it's the same story as this film, right? He reanimates the Golem in then the 20th century.
I think that's a Hammer horror film, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know how, Roddy McDowall would necessarily have knowledge of the precise Jewish mysticism, word magic, as you call it, to bring a golem to life. But hey, it's Hammer horror. What can you say?
Yeah, I remember it also kind of ripped off the Psycho, I think, in addition to Golem in the basement. He had his dead mother in the attic. And the X-Files did a Golem episode, which I thought was pretty effective. So the character has some legs. They're made of clay. He's got feet of clay, but he's got legs.
There was also a French Golem film in 1935. It was a co-production with Czechoslovakia. And then the Czechs did something, I think it was called The Golem and the Emperor in the early 1950s, after they had been absorbed by the Warsaw Pact. So, the characters cropped up in other countries, but in terms of sort of the great and iconic horror characters, unfortunately, he tends to trail the pack a little bit.
Now, getting back to Wagner, he starred in these films, he directed them, but despite the Jewish themes of his films, he did not seem to get in trouble when the Nazis came to power, right? Because he did some work with the German film industry during the Nazi era.
Yeah, he's in at least three or four of Goebbels' high-end A-list propaganda productions. He worked very steadily in sound films in Berlin during the 1930s and all through the war. So I guess that means he was of sufficient, quote, Aryan lineage, unquote, to be able to work, in the German film industry in those days, which of course was completely under the whip hand of Dr. Joseph Goebbels, PhD.
Which would be interesting if anybody could resurrect this whole picture, because even from that footage, I didn't get a sense of sort of deep interest or sympathy with Jewish tradition. I think it may have been just a stand-in for a wizard, with the monster really being the focal point. Anyway, interesting picture, and glad you got a chance to share some of this rare footage with us. And glad you were able to join us again for another episode of Channel Zero TV. For Channel Zero TV, I'm John,
And I'm John.
and we'll catch you next time.